Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating report.
Yeah.
It's called the Indigenous World 2014 Yearbook. And
Dense.
yeah, it is dense. I mean, it's packed with info about indigenous peoples all over the world.
Globally.
Yeah, globally, back in 2013. And it's got everything you can think of.
Everything.
Country reports, legal battles, cultural
It's a
shifts.
treasure
I
trail.
mean, we're talking about a year that was full of um, progress setbacks.
Pivotal year.
Yeah, pivotal year.
Oh,
And we thought,
let's unpack it.
let's unpack it, and try to figure out
What are the big takeaways?
yeah, what surprised us, what's in here that we can all kind of learn from. And
What's in there for the listener?
yeah, exactly. So one of the things that really jumped out at me was this whole lead up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples,
Right.
which was going to happen in 2014.
Right.
What was going on in 2013 that was kind of building up to that?
So a key event was the Ulta Conference in Norway in June of 2013. And this was a huge gathering of indigenous peoples from all over the world.
Wow.
I mean, think about it, over 370 million people representing 5,000 distinct indigenous groups,
That's incredible.
all coming together
Yeah.
to kind of formulate their aspirations and their goals for the World Conference.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah,
It really speaks to how important that World Conference was going to be.
absolutely.
What was the outcome of the Alta Conference?
So the Alta Conference resulted in the Alta Outcome Document, which essentially was their collective voice.
Okay.
Going into the World Conference, it highlighted the things they were concerned about, their priorities and their vision for the future.
So it really set the stage for this global conversation that was about to happen
They did
about
great.
Indigenous rights and self-determination. And it wasn't just about getting ready for this conference.
Right.
I mean, this yearbook shows that indigenous communities were really working to kind of reshape their relationship with states.
Actively?
Yeah, actively. What are some examples of that?
Well, one example is Tanzania,
Okay.
where in 2013, a constitutional review process was underway.
Interesting.
And for the first time ever, this review aimed to be inclusive of all sectors of society with a particular focus on indigenous peoples.
That's encouraging. So,
Oh.
it was meant to be genuine.
Yeah, like a real effort to include those voices.
Yeah.
Was that reflected in the actual changes that they were proposing?
Yes. The initial draft explicitly addressed representation, education, and land rights for minorities with a clear emphasis on indigenous communities.
Wow. So that's like a huge step towards greater inclusion
It is a major step.
within their legal framework.
Yeah, within their legal framework.
Wow. Were there any contrasting examples, like where things weren't going so well?
Unfortunately, yes. In Nepal, which was also undergoing a constitutional review at the time, the process was criticized for not being genuinely inclusive.
Interesting.
So despite having an indigenous population of at least 36%,
Wow, that's a huge percentage
huge percentage
of the population. The review process failed to respect their right to representation through their own institutions.
So they weren't being heard.
They weren't being heard, essentially.
And what were the implications of that?
Well, the Constituent Assembly was heavily based on a political party system that favored the elite.
Okay.
And this was hindering the progress of what's called identity-based federalism.
Okay.
So essentially, the unique needs and aspirations of these diverse indigenous groups were not being adequately addressed.
There's two very different approaches happening at the same time.
Exactly.
And you can see how these communities are really trying to, shape their futures and demand a seat at the table.
Absolutely.
When their rights are at stake. But the path to justice is rarely easy or straightforward.
It's complex.
Yeah, it's complex. And this yearbook really kind of sheds light on how challenging it can be to achieve justice, particularly in countries with a history of violence and discrimination against indigenous peoples. And the situation in Guatemala in 2013, I think, really kind of exemplifies that.
Absolutely. Guatemala's landmark genocide trial of former President Efraín Ríos Montt was a major event.
Yeah, this trial seems incredibly significant.
Yeah.
What was Ríos Montt actually on trial for?
So he was being tried for genocide and crimes against humanity committed during his presidency in the 1980s.
Okay.
And the trial focused on the brutal massacres of the Maya Ixil indigenous people during Guatemala's civil war.
That's awful. It sounds like a really important moment in their history, like a chance to actually confront this dark past and
Absolutely.
hold those responsible accountable. What happened?
It was a mixed bag.
Okay.
And ultimately a heartbreaking one for the Maya Ixil Ríos Montt was convicted of genocide.
Wow.
And sentenced to 80 years in prison.
That's huge.
However, just 10 days later,
Oh, no.
The Constitutional Court overturned the verdict,
What?
sending shockwaves through the country and the international community.
So a moment of hope and then just like a crushing setback.
Absolutely.
What were the implications of this?
Well, it really underscored the complexities of seeking justice
Yeah.
for Indigenous peoples. On the one hand, it showed that holding powerful figures accountable for horrific crimes was possible,
Right.
even in countries with deeply entrenched power structures. But the overturning of the verdict exposed the fragility of these gains and the persistent reality of impunity.
Yeah, it's a reminder that it's an ongoing battle and there's still so much work to do
So much work to do.
to make sure that these atrocities are addressed and that people are held accountable.
Absolutely.
And this whole Rios Montt trial, I think it highlights how important international frameworks like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Right, the UNDIP.
yeah, or UNDIP, are because they provide some guidelines for protecting Indigenous rights.
They do. It's a beacon of hope and a powerful tool for Indigenous communities worldwide.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how these international frameworks kind of intersect with the local struggles
Yeah.
that are happening as Indigenous communities are navigating these complexities
Absolutely.
of their relationships with states and with corporations.
For sure.
Land rights in particular emerge as a central theme in this yearbook, especially when it comes to the impact of extractive industries on Indigenous communities. Should we start by looking at Greenland?
Let's do it.
All right, so in 2013, Greenland was trying to attract investment in its extractive industries.
Yeah, they were in the midst of a push.
Okay, and the London Mining Company was granted a 30-year license to develop this massive iron ore mine.
Huge.
Yeah, it's called the IWGIA project.
That's a huge undertaking.
30 years for this giant mine. What were some of the concerns surrounding this project?
Well, there were concerns about the potential for large-scale environmental damage
Okay.
to this delicate Arctic ecosystem.
Makes sense.
But it wasn't just about the environmental impact. There were also worries about what's known as social dumping.
Social dumping, what is that?
Essentially, it means that the company was planning to import thousands of foreign workers,
Okay.
mainly from China, to work on the project,
Wow.
under separate legislation that's designed to lower labor costs.
So undercutting their own
Yeah, basically.
labor standards.
Yeah, and raising concerns about exploitation of these workers and unfair competition for local workers.
So disregard for the local workforce, were there other concerns about the IWGIA project?
Yes, the process itself was also criticized for its lack of transparency.
Interesting.
The organization Greenland Transparency argued that the public hearings were more about selling the project than engaging in genuine dialogue and considering alternative perspectives.
So it seems like a classic case of profits over people and the environment.
It does seem that way.
And this whole situation in Greenland, it reminds me of what we've seen in other parts of the world, this disconnect between policies and practices.
Yeah.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, it's a complex issue with a long history, but often it comes down to power imbalances
Okay.
and ingrained prejudices and a failure to truly understand and respect the rights and perspectives of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and unfortunately, these same patterns seem to be playing out in a lot of different countries. And
Yeah.
the yearbook paints a rather bleak picture of what was going on in Russia in 2013.
Yeah, Russia in 2013 saw a series of government actions that undermined the rights and representation of Indigenous peoples.
Okay.
A particularly concerning move was the suspension of RAMPON,
Okay.
the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North.
What was Arayapon and why was it suspended?
So RAIPON was the national umbrella organization representing indigenous interests in Russia,
Okay.
and its suspension was widely seen as an attempt to silence the collective voice of indigenous peoples and limit their ability to advocate for their rights.
So silencing the very organization that's supposed to represent them, what were the implications of that?
It created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty,
Okay.
especially in the lead up to the 7th Congress of Indigenous Peoples of the North. It also hindered their ability to engage in policy discussions and hold the government accountable.
So basically cutting them out of the conversation, were there other specific policies or actions in Russia that were causing concern?
There were several. For example, the exclusion of ethnic общиnas, which are traditional indigenous communities, from fishing laws, was a major blow.
Wow, so they were losing their...
Livelihoods!
They were losing access to these really valuable fishing resources that were redirected away from the indigenous communities and toward commercial stakeholders and recreational fishing.
So not only silencing their voices, but actually taking away their ability to make a living and sustain themselves.
Absolutely. Directly threatening these traditional fishing practices that are central to their livelihoods and cultural identity.
And it doesn't seem like this disregard for indigenous rights was limited to just fishing.
You're right. Similar concerns were raised about broader natural resource legislation and government decisions regarding resource use in the Arctic.
Okay.
Despite constitutional protections for indigenous rights in Russia, the implementation has been inconsistent at best. Changes in legislation often conflict with the spirit of those protections, leaving indigenous communities vulnerable.
Yeah, again, that gap between what's on paper and what's happening in reality.
And that gap is often filled with exploitation and just taking away what rightfully belongs to these communities.
Sadly, yes.
The yearbook kind of presents a little bit of a mixed picture in Canada in 2013,
Right.
where indigenous communities were facing challenges, but there were also some opportunities. Should we start with the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement,
Okay.
sometimes called the NLCA?
NLCA.
What was that, and how is its implementation going?
So the NLCA was a landmark agreement that was signed 2 decades prior
Okay.
that granted the Inuit of Nunavut ownership of mineral rights in a large portion of their traditional territory.
Wow. So that's a huge step towards self-determination and being able to control their own economic future.
It was a major step.
But what was happening with it in 2013?
So in 2013, the implementation of the agreement was facing some significant challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Concerns were raised about the slow pace of progress and inadequate government support.
So they weren't getting the help they needed.
Right, and this actually led to a lawsuit filed by Nunavut Incorporated, or NTI, against the Canadian government for failing to fully uphold the terms of the agreement.
So they weren't living up to their end of the bargain.
Exactly.
So it's a great agreement in principle.
On paper.
Yeah, but it wasn't really translating into anything concrete.
Right, it was struggling.
Yeah. Were there any other notable developments in Canada that year?
Yes, the Joint Review Panel's recommendation to approve the Northern Gateway project was a major source of contention.
What was that?
It was a controversial pipeline project.
Okay.
And the panel ultimately recommended that the project move forward,
Right.
despite concerns raised by Indigenous communities about potential environmental and cultural impacts.
So again, those voices weren't being heard.
Right. And there was criticism of inadequate consultation processes.
So basically like a decision being made without their consent.
Without their free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're seeing this pattern of disregarding Indigenous voices and prioritizing economic interests over their rights.
Unfortunately, yes, it seems like a familiar pattern.
Yeah, a recurring theme. Were there any positive developments in Canada?
There were some positive legal battles being fought.
Oh,
One landmark case was the Silkwat Nation's fight before the Supreme Court for recognition of their title to their traditional lands.
wow. So this case could have huge implications for Indigenous land rights.
It set a precedent.
Yeah, not just in Canada, but potentially globally. It's a good reminder that even when they're facing all this adversity,
Absolutely.
they're still fighting for their rights and pushing for change.
They are.
And speaking of legal battles and pushing for change, the yearbook also highlights a mixed bag of developments in the United States.
It does.
What are some examples?
On the one hand, we see the inspiring story of the San Carlos Apache tribe in Arizona
Okay.
successfully lobbying against a massive copper mine
Wow.
that threatened their sacred lands.
So they were able to stop it.
They were.
That's amazing. What
Amazing.
does that tell us?
This victory demonstrated the power of Indigenous advocacy and the growing recognition of the importance of protecting cultural and spiritual sites.
That's so powerful to see them mobilizing to protect what's sacred to them.
Absolutely.
It's a testament to their resilience.
Yeah.
Were there any kind of contrasting examples in the U.S.?
There were the Crow tribe in Montana,
Okay.
partnered with Cloud Peak Energy for coal development on the reservation.
So they were kind of embracing this development.
And while this highlighted the complex economic realities faced by many Indigenous communities,
Right.
it also raised concerns about the potential environmental and health impacts of coal mining.
So a really complicated situation where they're trying to, balance economic needs with these environmental and cultural concerns.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah. How do we ensure that Indigenous communities have a say in these decisions that are impacting their lands and their livelihoods?
Such an important question.
And speaking of Indigenous voices and perspectives, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, let's talk about the unique challenges faced by Indigenous women.
Absolutely.
What was going on in 2013?
So 2013 was a significant year for Indigenous women, marked by the World Conference of Indigenous Women held in Lima, Peru in October.
Okay, so this is bringing together Indigenous women from all over the world.
From around the globe.
Yeah, what were they discussing?
The discussions covered a wide range of issues,
Okay.
including the upcoming World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, as well as global development agendas like the Cairo Plus 20 and Beijing Plus 20 platforms for action.
So really focusing on those women's rights and empowerment?
Absolutely.
What was the main goal of the conference?
The primary goal was to amplify the voices of Indigenous women
Oh, okay.
and ensure their perspectives and priorities were included in these international human rights and development discussions.
So making sure that they had a seat at the table,
Exactly.
that their voices were heard.
And it was about recognizing the unique challenges they face:
Yeah.
discrimination, violence, lack of access to resources and opportunities, and advocating for policies that address these issues and empower Indigenous women.
So it sounds like a really important moment for Indigenous women to connect and share their stories
Wow.
and advocate for change.
Absolutely.
And it's a good place to end this first part of our deep dive into what was happening in the world of Indigenous peoples in 2013.
It is. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2014 report. We've already seen some pretty intense examples of the challenges and triumphs Indigenous peoples experienced in 2013. Ready for more?
Absolutely. It's those specific stories that really bring it to life and help us understand what was going on.
Definitely. So let's head back up to the Arctic,
Right.
specifically Greenland. Remember our discussion about the IWGIA iron ore mine?
Yeah, that huge project.
Huge project. And the lack of transparency surrounding it?
Right.
Well, a similar issue was playing out with the oil industry.
Interesting.
The Inuit Circumpolar Council, or ICC, requested information from authorities about specific oil exploration activities.
So again, this theme of transparency or the lack thereof.
Yeah, it seems like a pattern.
How did the authorities respond to that request?
They basically stonewalled them. They claimed they couldn't release the information because it was considered commercially confidential.
Oh, wow. So
Yeah.
hiding behind that excuse.
Yeah, and this lack of transparency just fueled anxieties about the potential environmental and social consequences of oil exploration in the region.
Right. It's like they're not even trying to be open and honest.
Not really. It felt like a pattern of secrecy and
It
exclusion.
makes you wonder, who these decisions are really benefiting.
It does.
Let's shift gears now and go back to Russia.
Okay.
We talked earlier about how policy changes can really deeply impact indigenous communities there.
Right.
And the exclusion of those ethnic obscenas from fishing laws was just one example.
Yeah, prime example.
It doesn't seem like that was an isolated incident.
Not at all. Similar concerns arose regarding broader natural resource legislation and government decisions about resource use in the Arctic.
So it was like a pattern of behavior.
Yeah, a pattern.
Were there any specific examples that kind of illustrate this disconnect?
Well, one example is the concept paper on sustainable development of the indigenous small-numbered peoples of the North.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. It was a policy adopted in 2009,
Okay.
and it outlined a plan to promote sustainable development for these communities.
Sounds good.
But despite having an action plan, many key components were never carried out.
Oh, so it's just empty promises.
Empty promises.
And a lack of follow-through.
Yeah, a lack of follow-through.
It's no wonder that these communities feel ignored and marginalized.
I know, it's frustrating.
Their concerns seem to be constantly sidelined in favor of economic development,
Yeah,
even when those developments are actually threatening their ways of life.
exactly. And that tension between development and indigenous rights is a recurring theme, isn't it?
It really is. We're seeing it over and over again.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Canada for a second.
Okay.
We were talking about those challenges with implementing the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement.
Right.
But were there any Indigenous communities in Canada who were taking initiative and kind of pushing for positive change?
There were. Amidst those challenges, there were definitely communities that were taking charge.
Give me some examples. What were they doing?
Well, for one, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, or IRC, in the Northwest Territories,
Okay.
they achieved a significant milestone. They completed negotiations for a self-government agreement in principle.
Wow, so they were really taking control of their own destiny.
Yeah, this paved the way for greater autonomy and control over their own affairs.
That's really inspiring to see. Were there other examples of this?
Yes, in Nunavut, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, or ITK,
Okay.
the National Inuit Organization was actively advocating for the inclusion of traditional knowledge in scientific research and policy decisions.
So bringing those two worlds together,
Yeah, bridging that gap.
what was their rationale behind that?
They believe that Inuit traditional knowledge is vital,
Okay.
especially when it comes to environmental stewardship and sustainable development in the Arctic.
That makes sense.
And ITK's president, Terry Odla, He emphasized this point at the ArcticNet annual scientific meeting,
Okay.
a gathering of researchers and policymakers.
So they were really trying to get that message out there.
Absolutely.
Did I2K have any other notable achievements that year?
They did. Their Amajak National Center for Inuit Education received the prestigious Arctic Inspiration Prize.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was a significant recognition of their efforts to advance Inuit education across the country.
That's wonderful. And it highlights the importance of those culturally relevant education initiatives
Absolutely.
in empowering Indigenous communities.
For sure. Investing in education is investing in the future.
Exactly. Now let's go back to the United States for a second.
Okay.
We talked about the San Carlos Apache tribe's success in preventing that copper mine.
Yeah,
But the report also sheds light on a much darker side of the U.S. story.
it does.
This ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah. This issue was a major focus during the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR,
Okay.
of the U.S. Human Rights Record in 2013.
And what happened?
Several countries expressed concern about the alarmingly high rates of violence against Indigenous women and the lack of an adequate response from the U.S. government.
That's awful. What kind of recommendations did they make?
They urged the U.S. to implement a national action plan to combat this violence,
Oh,
to conduct a national public inquiry into the issue,
makes sense.
and to ensure accurate data collection and reporting by law enforcement.
So these are really concrete steps that they could take.
Yeah,
How did the U.S. government respond to these recommendations?
they rejected them.
What?
Stating that they considered the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDIRIP, to be merely an aspirational, non-binding instrument.
So they're basically dismissing these recommendations.
Yeah, and the very framework that's meant to protect Indigenous rights.
That's really troubling. Did the report provide any further insight into this issue?
It did. A report by Statistics Canada, for example, indicated that the national homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada was at least 7 times higher than for non-Indigenous women.
Oh my God.
While this statistic is from Canada,
Right.
it highlights the systemic nature of this violence across borders.
Yeah, those numbers are shocking, and they really underscore how urgent this issue is.
They do.
And it's a reminder that even in countries like the U.S. and Canada, which are often seen as progressive, Indigenous women are facing this disproportionate level of violence
Absolutely.
and systemic neglect.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Mexico now.
Okay.
The yearbook highlights some interesting things happening there in 2013.
Yeah. So Mexico in 2013 was in a period of political transition
Okay.
with a new president, Enrique Peña Nieto, who had taken office in late 2012.
Right.
During his first year, he announced the creation of the Commission for Dialogue with Indigenous Peoples.
A commission for dialogue that sounds promising.
It does.
What were people hoping for?
There was hope that this commission would revitalize the spirit of the San Andres Accords, a peace agreement signed in 1996 between the government and the Zapatista National Liberation Army, or EZLN. However, there was also skepticism.
Yeah. Given their history.
Yeah, given the history of unfulfilled commitments.
Right. So cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism.
Did the report delve into any specific issues that were shaping the Indigenous landscape in Mexico that year?
It did. For example, the Huixárika people in Jalisco continued their fight to reclaim their ancestral lands in Huiracuta,
Okay.
which is a sacred territory that's threatened by mining interests.
So again, that struggle to protect their cultural and spiritual heritage,
Absolutely.
even in the face of all these economic pressures.
Yeah, and government inaction.
Were there any other communities taking a stand?
Absolutely. The Purepecha community in Cherán, Michoacán,
Okay.
they had taken matters into their own hands a few years prior. They expelled political parties from their community and formed their own system of governance and security to combat illegal logging and drug trafficking.
So they were really reclaiming their autonomy.
Yeah, taking control of their own destiny.
That's incredible. Were there any other communities facing similar challenges?
There were. The ongoing conflicts in the state of Oaxaca were also highlighted,
Okay.
where the Truckee people were facing violence and displacement stemming from land disputes and political rivalries.
Are those deep-seated inequalities and power imbalances
Yeah.
that we've been talking about?
Absolutely.
And they continue to persist in so many parts of the world.
They do.
Let's go back to Central America now, starting with Guatemala.
Okay.
We already talked about that Rios Montt genocide trial
Right.
and its devastating reversal.
Yeah, a heartbreaking case.
Did the pursuit of justice and healing continue despite that setback?
It did. Truth commissions and human rights organizations continued their work documenting the human rights violations that Indigenous people suffered during the conflict.
So keeping that memory alive.
Keeping the memory alive and pushing for accountability.
Yeah, and that's so important so that those who suffered are not forgotten, and so that history doesn't repeat itself.
Yeah.
Were there any other significant developments in Central America that year?
Sadly, Honduras saw the tragic murders of several indigenous leaders.
Oh, no.
In 2013, shining a light on the dangers that these people face when they defend their lands and their rights.
That's awful. Who were some of the victims?
Among those murdered were members of the Tulupan people in the Department of Yoro,
Okay.
who had been resisting mining and logging activities on their traditional territories.
And their deaths sparked outrage and demands for an end to this impunity and this violence. So
It was a huge outcry.
it's chilling to think that for a lot of these indigenous leaders, defending their lands and their rights can be a matter of life or death.
It's a harsh reality.
Were there other cases that the report highlighted?
Yes, the internationally renowned case of Berta Cáceres was also mentioned.
Okay.
He was a prominent indigenous activist and leader of Capinage,
Right.
an organization that had been resisting the Aguasarca hydroelectric dam project,
Okay.
which threatened the Golcarque River,
Right.
a sacred site for the Lenca people.
So another courageous voice speaking out against these powerful forces and facing those consequences.
Unfortunately,
What was going on in Nicaragua that year?
a contentious legal battle was unfolding.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities in the South Atlantic Autonomous Region, or RAS, challenged the constitutionality of a law
Okay.
that granted a concession to a Chinese company for the construction of a canal across their territories.
So this canal was going to cut right through their lands.
Right through their land.
And they weren't consulted.
They argued that this law violated their rights to land resources and self-determination.
And that they hadn't given their free, prior, and informed consent for the project.
Exactly.
What was the outcome of this legal challenge?
Sadly, the Supreme Court of Justice rejected their appeal.
Of course they did.
And this ruling prioritized the investment interests of the Chinese company over the traditional and historic collective ownership rights of these indigenous peoples.
So again, we're seeing that those scales of justice are often tipped against indigenous communities.
It's a recurring theme.
What was happening in Costa Rica?
So Costa Rica, despite its image as a relatively progressive country,
Right.
also grappled with issues of indigenous rights and land tenure in 2013.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Not exactly. The report pointed to a recurring pattern of the state denying indigenous communities their right to consultation
Okay.
on matters that directly affect them.
So again, cutting them out of the conversation.
Yeah, including development projects and policies related to education, health, and cultural preservation.
Were there specific examples of this disconnect?
Yes. The implementation of the REDD Plus program is one example.
Okay.
It's an international initiative designed to reduce deforestation and promote sustainable forest management.
Okay.
But despite calls from indigenous communities for meaningful consultation on how the program would be implemented, the state basically imposed its own model.
So they weren't listening
Not really.
to the people who are actually living on the land.
And they disregarded traditional forest use practices.
So a missed opportunity to really incorporate that traditional knowledge into those conservation efforts.
Yeah, it's a shame.
Because those communities often have a deep understanding of their environment
Right.
and those sustainable ways of living.
Absolutely.
Did the report have any other observations about Costa Rica?
Yes, it pointed to a pervasive problem of omission and inaction as a state policy.
Oh, wow.
Promises and commitments to indigenous communities often went unfulfilled, leaving them feeling neglected and disenfranchised.
Again, those empty promises.
Yeah, a pattern of empty promises and unmet needs.
Sadly, we've seen that over and over.
Over and over again.
What was going on in South America? Let's start with Colombia.
Okay, so Colombia in 2013 was in the midst of complex peace talks
Okay.
between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC.
Right.
And amidst these negotiations, indigenous communities were voicing their concerns.
About the peace process.
Yeah, about the potential impact any peace agreement might have on their land's rights and self-determination.
So they were worried that peace might come at their expense.
They were apprehensive given the history of conflict and the potential for their interests to be overlooked.
Yeah. What were some of their specific concerns?
They were worried that agreements on land restitution and rural development might infringe upon their ancestral territories
Okay.
or prioritize the interests of non-indigenous communities.
So they would be left out.
Yeah, and they also feared increased resource extraction and development projects in their territories as part of post-conflict reconstruction efforts.
So basically, they were worried that the peace process would open up their lands to exploitation.
Exactly.
Did they take any action to make sure their voices were heard?
They did. The Minga Indigena y Popular,
Okay.
a national indigenous movement, organized protests and dialogues with the government.
So they were making themselves heard.
They were.
And did it have any impact?
It did. They successfully secured a commitment from the government to amend decrees related to land rights and agrarian reform, specifically to protect indigenous territories from being negatively impacted by these post-conflict development initiatives.
That's a big win.
It was a significant victory.
It shows the power of collective action.
Absolutely.
Were there any other significant events in Colombia that year?
Yes. The 2 Regional Amazonian Summit,
Okay.
organized by IWGIA, the coordinating body of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin,
Okay.
was held in Villavicencio in December 2013.
So bringing together indigenous leaders from across the Amazon basin,
From across the Amazon Basin,
what were they discussing?
they discussed strategies for protecting their territories, cultures, and livelihoods.
Yeah, because they're all facing these shared challenges.
Absolutely. Deforestation, extractive industries, climate change.
These are huge issues.
Huge issues.
That require everyone to work together.
That's right. It's a reminder that these issues transcend national borders and require a unified response.
Absolutely. What was going on in Venezuela?
Venezuela was grappling with the implications of its socialist government's policies on indigenous communities. Okay.
While the government had implemented some positive measures, like the organic law on indigenous peoples and communities.
Okay, so good on paper.
Yeah, good on paper. But there were concerns about the lack of effective implementation.
Right, that gap again.
Yeah, and the impact of development projects on indigenous territories.
Were there specific events or issues that kind of highlight this disconnect?
Yes. The government's push for mining and oil extraction activities in indigenous territories was a major concern.
So again, economic development coming at the expense of indigenous rights and environmental concerns.
Yeah, a familiar story.
Did the report give any insights into how the government was addressing these concerns?
Not really. The government's emphasis on national development and economic growth often overshadowed the rights and interests of indigenous communities.
It's like their concerns were an afterthought.
Pretty much. Despite constitutional provisions protecting indigenous territories, the implementation of those protections remained weak.
So again, those words on paper not really translating into action.
What about Suriname? What was happening there?
A long-standing issue in Suriname has been the lack of recognition of indigenous land rights.
Okay.
And in 2013, the appointment of a presidential commissioner on land rights offered a glimmer of hope.
A glimmer of hope, but
There was very little tangible progress.
so a long road ahead.
Yeah, a long road ahead.
Did the report mention any other notable developments?
The impact of mining activities was a major concern.
Okay.
Particularly gold mining.
Right.
Mercury contamination from gold mining posed serious health risks to indigenous communities.
So again, extractive industries posing a direct threat to
Absolutely.
the health and well-being of these people.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the true costs of these development projects.
It really does.
Yeah.
Let's move on to French Guiana.
Okay, so French Guiana saw a disturbing escalation of violence and threats against indigenous communities,
no.
stemming from the activities of illegal gold miners.
So basically lawlessness running rampant
Yeah.
and indigenous communities caught in the crossfire.
Bearing the brunt of it.
Were there any further details in the report?
Yes. The NGO Guyana Solidarity had been monitoring mercury levels in the Guyana population for several years,
Okay.
and their findings in 2013 showed the highest levels of mercury contamination ever recorded,
Oh, wow.
with serious health risks, especially for children.
That's devastating.
It is a very serious situation.
Did the Guyana people take any action?
They did. The Organization of Indigenous Nations of Guyana, or ONAG,
Okay.
along with Guyana Solidarity, filed a legal complaint against the French state,
So holding them accountable.
holding them accountable for failing to protect indigenous communities from the harmful effects of this illegal mining,
And demanding action.
demanding action to address the mercury contamination.
It's inspiring to see them fighting back against these injustices.
Absolutely.
What about Ecuador? What was happening there?
Ecuador in 2013 was embroiled in a contentious debate
Okay.
about oil drilling in Yasuni National Park.
Okay.
It's a biodiversity hotspot and home to indigenous communities, including groups living in voluntary isolation.
Wow.
President Rafael Correa's decision to open up the park to oil exploitation sparked protests
Of course it did.
from indigenous groups and environmental activists.
So again, development goals versus environmental protection and indigenous rights.
Exactly.
What was the government's reasoning behind this decision?
The government argued that oil revenues were crucial for funding social programs and reducing poverty.
Okay.
However, Critics question the sustainability of this approach and the potential for environmental damage and the violation of indigenous rights.
So short-term gains versus long-term consequences.
Exactly.
Did the government even consult with the indigenous communities before making this decision?
The consultation process was criticized as inadequate
Okay.
and lacking free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous communities felt like their voices weren't being heard.
So again, that top-down decision-making
Right.
that just completely ignores
Disregards.
indigenous self-determination. It's disheartening, but not surprising, unfortunately. Let's move on to Peru. What was the situation like there?
Peru was still dealing with the legacy of internal conflict and facing the challenges of achieving social justice and inclusion for indigenous communities.
Right.
The report highlighted stark disparities that persisted between indigenous and non-indigenous populations in terms of access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
So those deep-seated inequalities that we've seen in other countries?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Did the report provide any specific examples or data to illustrate this?
It did. The 2007 Census of Indigenous Communities revealed some troubling statistics.
Okay.
Nearly half of the indigenous population was under 15 years of age.
Wow.
And almost half had no health insurance.
That's awful.
Illiteracy rates were high, especially among women.
Right.
And access to basic services like clean water and sanitation was limited in many communities.
It's a really stark picture of marginalization and exclusion. Were there any efforts being made to address these issues?
The government had implemented some social programs targeted at indigenous communities, but they were limited in their effectiveness and reach. Indigenous organizations continued to advocate for greater autonomy, recognition of their land rights, and inclusion in decision-making processes.
So a lot of work still to be done.
A lot of work to be done.
Let's move on to Bolivia. What was going on there?
Bolivia, under the leadership of Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous president, continued to promote policies aimed at empowering indigenous communities and recognizing their rights.
Okay, so that's positive.
It is positive, but there were challenges in implementing these policies and addressing the persistent inequalities.
So progress, but still obstacles.
Yeah.
What were some of the events or issues that capture this dynamic?
Well, in December 2013, the Danish NGO IBIS was expelled from Bolivia.
Expelled? Why?
This sparked controversy and raised concerns about shrinking space for civil society, particularly for those organizations working on indigenous rights.
So silencing those voices that are trying to help.
Exactly.
IBIS had a long history of working with indigenous communities.
It did. A long history of supporting indigenous organizations and advocating for their rights.
Right.
And its expulsion was seen as a sign that the government was becoming less tolerant of dissenting voices.
Not a good sign. Were there any other events or issues of concern?
Yes. The government's push for mega development projects, including dams and highways, sparked concerns about their impact on indigenous territories and the lack of consultation with affected communities.
So again, that tension between development priorities and indigenous rights.
Yeah, the Tipenies conflict, which erupted a couple of years prior over the construction of a highway through an indigenous territory and national park, was still simmering.
So those wounds were still fresh.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to Brazil. What was the situation like there?
2013 saw a troubling resurgence of threats to indigenous land rights and a rollback of protections that had been put in place in previous years.
So they were going backwards?
Yeah, it was like they were trying to undo the progress that had been made.
Why was that happening?
The government, under pressure from powerful agricultural and mining interests, took steps to weaken FUNAI, the national agency responsible for Indigenous Affairs.
So taking away their support system.
Yeah, and to undermine the demarcation of indigenous territories.
So basically opening up their lands to exploitation.
Exactly.
Were there specific examples of these policy changes?
Several decrees and legislative proposals were put forward to restrict the expansion of demarcated indigenous lands, to limit indigenous land rights, and to give greater leeway to extractive industries operating in those territories.
Like a coordinated attack.
It really was, and these measures were met with strong opposition from indigenous organizations and human rights groups.
But were they able to stop it?
It was an uphill battle.
Did the report mention any communities that were impacted by these changes?
The situation in Mato Grosso do Sul state, which has a large indigenous population, was particularly worrisome. Land conflicts between indigenous communities and ranchers escalated, leading to violence, displacement, and human rights violations. The Guarani Kiowa people, who have been fighting for recognition of their ancestral lands for decades, continued to face threats and attacks.
It's just tragic to see these communities caught in this cycle of violence and dispossession.
It's heartbreaking.
What was happening in Paraguay in 2013?
Paraguay was dealing with the aftermath of the 2012 parliamentary coup that ousted President Fernando Lugo.
Okay.
And the new government took steps to roll back progress on indigenous rights and to further marginalize indigenous communities.
So a political shift with really negative consequences
Yeah,
for indigenous peoples.
absolutely.
What specific actions did the new government take?
They prioritized economic development, particularly in the agricultural sector,
Okay.
and this came at the expense of indigenous land rights and environmental protection.
So again, that same story.
Yeah. Deforestation rates soared as soy plantations and cattle ranching expanded,
Right.
encroaching upon indigenous territories and threatening their livelihoods.
So those short-term economic gains being prioritized over the long-term sustainability and well-being of these communities?
Exactly.
Did the report highlight any particular cases that kind of exemplify this?
The case of the Totobiagasot community in the Chaco region was especially alarming.
Okay.
Their ancestral lands were being threatened by deforestation and the establishment of a private reserve backed by the state.
So the state was actually complicit in this land grab
Yeah, it's a clear example of the ongoing dispossession and vulnerability.
that these communities are facing.
Yeah,
It's a story we've heard repeated so many times in this deep dive.
it is a recurring theme.
Indigenous communities being pushed off their lands, their rights being trampled on. Let's move on to Argentina.
Okay, so Argentina, like many countries in the Americas, was grappling with the legacy of colonialism
Right.
and the ongoing struggle of indigenous communities to secure their rights and territories.
Yeah. The report pointed to the persistence of discrimination, poverty, and lack of access to basic services in many indigenous communities.
So those same systemic inequalities.
Yeah.
Do they give any specific examples?
This situation of indigenous communities in the northern provinces, particularly in the Chaco region, was highlighted.
Okay.
Large-scale agricultural and forestry projects were being implemented on indigenous lands
Without their consent.
without their free, prior, and informed consent.
Of course.
And this led to deforestation, displacement, and environmental degradation.
Again, economic development trumping indigenous rights and the environment.
A familiar story.
Were there any specific communities or projects that were particularly affected?
The Wichi and Criollo communities in the Department of San Martin were facing a dire situation.
Okay.
Their territories were being surrounded by deforestation,
Wow.
leaving them with limited access to water, food, and essential resources. The expansion of soybean cultivation was identified as a major driver of this deforestation. It's just devastating to see the impact that this unchecked agricultural expansion is having on these communities and the environment.
It's a major problem.
Let's move on to Chile. What was happening there?
The Mapuche people in Chile continued their long-standing struggle for land rights and self-determination in 2013.
Okay.
Despite constitutional reforms recognizing indigenous peoples' discrimination and inequality persisted.
So again, those reforms not really translating into real change.
Right, and the Mapuche faced ongoing criminalization and state repression.
So being punished for demanding their rights.
Exactly.
What were some of the challenges that they were facing?
Their demands for the restitution of their ancestral lands,
Okay.
which had been taken from them during colonization and subsequent land grabs, were met with resistance from the state and private landowners.
Of course.
And the government's use of anti-terrorism laws to prosecute Mapuche activists further escalated tensions.
So using the law to silence them.
Yeah, essentially criminalizing dissent and resistance.
Were there any other notable events or issues?
The controversy surrounding the Hidroizum project.
Oh.
A massive hydroelectric dam project in Patagonia continued to unfold.
Another one of those mega projects?
Yeah.
Indigenous communities and environmental groups raised concerns about the project's impact on ecosystems, biodiversity, and indigenous territories.
Absolutely.
So again, indigenous communities caught in the crossfire
Yeah.
between those development interests and environmental concerns.
It's a recurring theme.
It really is.
Yeah.
Let's jump across the Pacific Ocean now to Australia.
Okay.
What was happening there in 2013?
Australia, like many other settler colonial nations, was grappling with the legacy of colonization
Right.
and the ongoing challenges of achieving reconciliation and social justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Yeah.
The report highlighted the persistence of inequalities in health, education, and economic opportunities,
Okay.
as well as the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system.
So those deeply ingrained systemic inequalities that we've seen in so many other places.
Unfortunately, yes.
Did the report provide any specific examples of these disparities?
It did, and the statistics were quite alarming.
Okay.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had significantly lower life expectancy,
Okay.
higher rates of chronic diseases, and lower levels of educational attainment
Wow.
compared to non-Indigenous Australians.
And they were also overrepresented in prisons and detention centers.
Yes.
So basically, every system is failing them.
It's a sobering reminder of the deep-seated inequities that continue to exist.
Were there any positive developments happening at the time that were aimed at addressing these issues?
The government had implemented some programs and policies aimed at closing the gap in
Right.
health and education outcomes,
Okay.
but progress remains slow. Indigenous organizations continue to advocate for greater self-determination, recognition of their land rights, and a more meaningful reconciliation process.
So again, a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, a long road ahead.
Let's move on to New Zealand. What was going on there?
New Zealand, in contrast to some of the countries we've discussed, saw some positive developments in recognizing and protecting Maori rights and interests.
So they were doing something right.
It seems like they were taking some positive steps.
What was different there?
The Treaty of Waitangi,
Okay.
a foundational document that established the relationship between the British Crown and Maori tribes,
Right.
continued to play a central role in shaping policies and legal decisions.
So they were actually honoring those treaty obligations.
It seems that way.
Did they give any specific examples of this in action?
Yes, a landmark Supreme Court ruling affirmed the Maori Council's right to be consulted on the government's proposed partial privatization of state-owned energy companies.
Wow. So they had a say in how those resources were being managed.
They did.
That's a really important victory for Indigenous rights.
It is. It's a good example of how legal mechanisms can be used to uphold treaty obligations and protect Indigenous interests.
Were there any other notable developments?
Yes, the Independent Police Conduct Authority released a report in 2013
Okay.
that found police had acted unlawfully during Operation 8,
Okay.
a controversial raid on a Maori community back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2014 report. We've journeyed from the Arctic to the Americas, and now we're heading to Southeast Asia and other parts of the world.
It's fascinating to see how those global trends we've been talking about, the tension between development and Indigenous rights,
Right.
the struggle for self-determination, the fight for cultural recognition, how they play out in different contexts.
Exactly. So let's jump right in and start with Indonesia. What was happening there in 2013?
Indonesia had a landmark constitutional court decision in 2013.
Okay.
The court recognized the rights of Indigenous peoples to their customary forests.
Wow, that sounds like a major victory for Indigenous land rights.
It was a huge step forward in recognizing Indigenous land tenure systems.
How did the government respond to this decision?
Well, the response was mixed. Some local governments embraced the decision, but others saw it as a threat to their authority.
Wow.
There were instances where mining companies actually removed signs that were put up by Indigenous communities asserting their ownership of customary forests.
So they were just ignoring the court ruling.
Yeah, and government forestry officials even threatened to arrest individuals who were trying to exercise their newly recognized rights.
So a legal victory, but not really translating into real change on the ground.
It's a classic case of those power dynamics and the resistance to recognizing Indigenous land rights.
Yeah, it seems like those are really deeply entrenched. Were there any other developments in Indonesia that year?
Yes, the passage of the law on village governance was a big one.
Okay.
It was a complex piece of legislation that had the potential to empower Indigenous communities.
Okay. How so?
It allowed them to determine their preferred model of village governance,
Okay.
including the option of desa adat, or Indigenous villages.
So they had more autonomy.
Exactly.
Right.
But the law also imposed a standardized traditional government structure on all village models, including desa adat.
So a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, and that simplification ignored the diverse realities of Indigenous governance systems across Indonesia.
So a step forward, but also a step back.
It's a good example of how even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Right. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. Let's move on to Malaysia. What was happening there in 2013?
Okay.
Indigenous peoples in Malaysia, often referred to as Orang Asli, continued to face challenges related to land rights, resource extraction, and discrimination.
So those same issues that we've been seeing in other parts of the world.
Yeah, despite some legal recognition of their customary land rights, the government's focus on economic development often led to land alienation and the displacement of indigenous communities.
So again, that tension between economic growth and indigenous land rights.
Absolutely, it's a global phenomenon.
Did the report provide any specific examples of how it's played out in Malaysia?
Yes, several court cases in 2013 highlighted the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities to protect their lands and resources.
Okay.
In one case, a court ruled that a portion of land be returned to the Semalai indigenous community near Temerloh, Pahang,
Okay.
recognizing their customary rights.
So a victory there.
It was a victory, but this victory was overshadowed by the difficulties faced by other communities.
So one step forward, two steps back.
Yeah, it shows that winning in court doesn't always translate into justice on the ground.
Right, because those systemic issues are still there.
All right.
What were some of the other challenges highlighted in Malaysia?
The Orang Selatar in Setulang Laut Johor,
Okay.
they continued to fight for compensation and recognition of their land rights, despite a court victory back in 2012.
So they won in court, but they were still fighting.
Still fighting, it's a long process.
It's really disheartening to see these communities having to constantly fight for their rights, even after they've won legal battles.
I know it speaks to a deeper lack of respect and recognition.
Let's move on to Thailand. What was the situation like there in 2013?
Indigenous peoples in Thailand, often referred to as hill tribes or ethnic minorities,
Yeah.
continue to face challenges related to citizenship, land rights, and cultural recognition.
So really fundamental issues.
Absolutely, many indigenous communities still lacked full citizenship rights.
Wow. So they were being denied basic rights based on their ethnicity.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how a community can thrive under those conditions.
It's a fundamental injustice.
Yeah.
What other challenges were they facing?
Land rights were a major point of contention.
That's fair.
The government's focus on establishing national parks and wildlife sanctuaries often led to the displacement of indigenous communities from their traditional territories.
So conservation efforts sometimes coming at the expense of indigenous communities.
Exactly. And they also had difficulty securing legal recognition of their land rights because the state didn't always acknowledge traditional land tenure systems.
So their ways of life weren't being respected.
Right.
What about Cambodia? What was happening there in 2013?
The ongoing struggle in Cambodia was against land grabbing and the loss of traditional lands and resources due to large-scale economic development projects.
So those same pressures that we've seen in other parts of Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. The government often prioritized investments in things like hydropower dams and agricultural concessions.
Right.
And this frequently led to the displacement of indigenous communities and the destruction of their forests and livelihoods.
So progress coming at a very steep price.
Yeah, were there any specific projects highlighted in the report?
I was just going to ask that.
The Lower Season 2 dam project was a major source of concern.
Okay.
This hydropower project in Stung Treng province threatened to displace tens of thousands of indigenous people
Wow.
and devastate the rich biodiversity of the area.
That's awful.
Despite these concerns, the project moved forward with little to no consultation with affected communities.
So they weren't even given a chance to voice their concerns.
And no consideration for their free, prior, and informed consent.
It's just another example of development being imposed on indigenous communities without regard for their rights or well-being.
It's a pattern we've seen repeated throughout our deep dive.
And it's incredibly disheartening what was happening in Vietnam.
In Vietnam, indigenous peoples officially recognized as ethnic minorities
Okay.
continued to face challenges related to land rights, cultural assimilation policies, and economic marginalization.
So again, that push towards assimilation.
Exactly. And the government's focus on national unity and economic development often came at the expense of indigenous cultures and traditional ways of life.
Were there specific examples of this?
Yes. The government's land allocation policies often fail to recognize indigenous customary land tenure systems,
Okay.
leading to conflicts and displacement. Additionally, the expansion of industrial agriculture, particularly rubber plantations,
Okay.
further encroached upon indigenous territories, disrupting their livelihoods.
So those dominant economic models just not taking into account the needs and rights of indigenous communities.
It's like they're being left behind or pushed aside in the pursuit of profit and progress.
What was the situation like in Laos?
In Laos, indigenous communities continued to struggle against land concessions and hydropower projects that threaten their traditional forests and livelihoods.
Those same pressures from extractive industries and large-scale development projects.
Yeah, the government's policy of granting large-scale land concessions to foreign investors for mining, agriculture, and other development projects often resulted in the displacement of indigenous communities.
Were there any specific examples of this?
The expansion of rubber plantations was a major concern.
Okay.
These plantations often took over indigenous lands without their consent, leading to deforestation, biodiversity loss, and disruption of indigenous livelihoods.
It's just heartbreaking to see how these extractive industries continue to expand with so little regard for the impact on indigenous communities and the environment.
It is a worrying trend. Let's move on to Burma, also known as Myanmar.
Okay. What was happening there in 2013?
Indigenous peoples in Burma continued to face a multitude of challenges. Armed conflict displacement, human rights violations, and the denial of land rights and self-determination were all major issues.
It sounds like a really complex and tragic situation.
It is. Decades of military rule and ethnic conflict had taken a heavy toll on indigenous communities, particularly those living in the border regions.
So their voices were being silenced.
Yeah. Were there any specific examples mentioned in the report?
I was just going to ask that.
The ongoing conflict in Kachin State, where the Kachin Independence Army was fighting for greater autonomy, led to widespread displacement and human rights abuses against indigenous communities.
So they were caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And the construction of hydropower dams on the Salween River, which flows through indigenous territories, also raised concerns about environmental damage and displacement.
So those development projects just adding to their suffering.
Sadly.
What was happening in Bangladesh?
In Bangladesh, indigenous peoples, often referred to as tribal or ethnic minorities, continued to face discrimination, land alienation, and violence, especially in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, or CHT.
So another region marked by conflict and historical injustices.
Right. This region is home to a diverse range of indigenous groups.
Okay.
And it has a long history of conflict between indigenous communities and the Bangladeshi government.
So what was the situation like there in 2013?
The report documented ongoing human rights violations against indigenous communities in the CHT, including land grabbing, forced evictions, violence, and restrictions on their cultural and religious practices.
So they were being targeted for being indigenous.
Essentially, and the militarization of the region and the presence of Bengali settlers created a climate of fear and tension,
Leading
to further displacement of indigenous peoples from their traditional lands.
just a reminder of how colonization and assimilation policies continued to dispossess and marginalize indigenous communities all over the world.
It's a sobering reality. And with that, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2014 report. It's been a whirlwind tour across the globe, and we've seen a lot of disheartening examples of the challenges faced by indigenous peoples worldwide.
It's been a lot to take in. But amidst all the struggles and the setbacks, there are also glimmers of hope.
Absolutely.
Communities organizing and resisting legal victories being won, and a growing global awareness of indigenous rights and issues.
It's important to remember that despite facing immense challenges, indigenous communities continue to demonstrate remarkable resilience and determination.
They're fighting for their lands, their cultures, their rights, and their very survival.
This report is a testament to their struggles, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to creating a better future for themselves and for generations to come.
It's a powerful reminder that we can't just sit back and let these injustices continue.
We all have a role to play in supporting indigenous communities and advocating for their rights.
So thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope that you've learned something new and that you'll continue to engage with these issues and support indigenous communities in whatever way you can.
And remember, this report is just a snapshot in time. It's up to all of us to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world for indigenous peoples everywhere.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you.